Welcome to our webinar. If Australasian Catholicism becomes synodal, the promise and vision of living faith, what are the potential benefits for Australasian Catholicism in becoming synodal? My name is John Warhurst, your moderator for this evening. I am a director of the Australasian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform, the co-hosts of this Zoom with Garratt Publishing. I'm speaking from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land in Canberra, Australia, and I acknowledge Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging. A particular welcome for any Indigenous person here this evening. The Synod on Synodality and its final document seem to have become yesterday's news, with hardly a mention in parishes or church conversations. Who cares? What is the point in discussing communion, participation and mission when nothing seems to change? Our speakers are Richard Lennan from Boston, where it is 5 a.m, and Benjamin from Sydney. They will share their hopes and visions for a revitalised, expansive and inclusive faith where Catholicism is a broad church. Chen from Tasmania will respond. I invite you now to engage in a brief moment of quiet reflection. The prayer for the Synod, adapted for the Diocese of Sandhurst in Australia, reads as follows. And as we embrace this synodal webinar, this prayer invites the Holy Spirit to be at work in us so that we may be a community and a people of grace. And the prayer. We stand before you, Holy Spirit, as we gather in your name, with you alone to guide us. Make yourself at home in our hearts. Teach us the way we must go and how we are to pursue it. Let us find in you our unity so that we may journey together to eternal life and remain faithful to the way of truth and what is right. All this we ask of you, who are at work in every place and time, in the name of the Father and the Son, forever and ever. Amen. In tonight's program, each speaker will speak for about 20 minutes. We'll then have a short break for discussion with Q&A for about 35 minutes, followed by a final response for 5 minutes, and that will take us an hour and a half to about 9 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. First, I'd like to welcome again Richard Lennan, who is a priest of the Diocese of Maitland-Newcastle, currently Professor of Systematic Theology in the School of Theology and Ministry at Boston College. He served as a theological advisor and team member to the preparation of Light from the Southern Cross in 2019, a document on reforming governance in the Catholic Church in Australia. Most recently, Richard was a member of the theological panel for the Plenary Council of Australia 2021 to 2022. A warm welcome again, Richard, and over to you.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you to everyone for the invitation to do this, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. I want to preface my remarks on, I want to talk primarily about the final document and how its vision, I think, remains a compelling one. But just to preface that with a few points about what I think the role of theology is here. Overall, my sense is that the task of theology in the life of the church is to name possibilities. Now, that might not be a textbook definition of theology, but I think it's one that really does arise out of how theology engages with the life of the church as it moves through history. And the core of possibility, of course, is the relationship that we as people of faith have with God. The fact that God is always going to exceed our grasp means that there's always more for us to move. In classic theological language, if the church has an eschatological orientation, if we're moving towards the fullness of life in God, if we're living in that experience of God in the present, but are a pilgrim people, then at any given moment of our history, we haven't reached our end. And that means we need to be open to movement. We need to be open to change and growth. And we need to be open to our own conversion. And I think that's part of what theology tries to name. And theology then can be a reminder to us that if we are a people in relationship to God, then our church is not merely our own construction. I often say to students that none of us get the church we would design for ourselves. And in part, that's because the large part, it's God's church, it's God's initiative, it's God's calling us on. But it's also a church filled with people other than myself. So that my idea of how it should be needs to come into dialogue with everyone else's idea of how it should be. And collectively, we need to keep on that pilgrimage. And as it is a pilgrimage, we don't get a perfect church along the way. We get a church that can always be more faithful, that can always be more consistent, that can always be more open to the challenges of history, to new questions, to new possibilities, and so on. And the question, I think, along the way for all of us is, if the church develops in a way that I would like it to, then who would I be in that church? How would I be part of contributing to bring about the church I would like to see? Because so often, all of us are very easily able to say, well, this is where those people need to change and what they should be doing. But I think to keep turning it back on ourselves, to develop that self-critical stance towards how is it that we are going to be called to conversion in this process. And my basis of my presentation really this morning is to think about the way that the Synod document calls us to be that. I think the Synod document, in a sense, like every document of the church's life, and indeed even like the gospel itself, is aspirational. It gives us a vision. It exhorts us to do something. But then that's got to be taken up. So I think the vision can be very powerful. It can offer us a lot. But as we all know, it's got to be internalized, and not just in other people, but in me as well, and then in us together. So that's the context for thinking about the document that I'd like to use this morning. So let me go to sharing my screen, and then just say a few things about the Synod document. Okay, so I want to make the case strongly that the Synod document offers a very hopeful vision for the future. But it's a vision that's predicated on the willingness of all of us to keep embracing that pilgrimage and to keep embracing our need for change. So all I want to do is just highlight a few features of that document that I think look towards a church that is better reflective of the possibilities that the Spirit of God is enabling for us. So the first thing then is just to get a sense of how we think about this document, because this is not only an unusual document, it is, I think you can make the case, it's a unique document in the life of the church. If the Synod represents the single most powerful expression of the church coming together, even beyond what we value of Vatican II. You know, people talk about the movement from between Vatican I and Vatican II, a movement from a sort of monarchical church where the focus was very much on the Pope to a collegial church where the focus is on the College of Bishops. A synodal church moves that in a different direction to where the focus is on all of the baptized. As Pope Francis often described it, it's inverting the pyramid. It's not beginning with the top, it's beginning with everyone and seeing how that flows out into the life of the church. One of the things I find most challenging about the Synodal document, and I would really strongly want to make the case that there's a radical nature to this document. I know it got a lot of criticism when it came out. It doesn't do this and it doesn't do that. I think to take it on its own terms as setting a vision, it is a powerful document. And at the heart of that is its emphasis to develop what it calls a spiritual disposition. It says that this is central to becoming a synodal church, to becoming a community that lives by the grace of the Holy Spirit, that lives by our relationship to each other. And some of the features of that spiritual disposition that you can see listed there, contemplation and so on. And the case we can make here is that all of those are demanding. You can look at that list and say, yes, that's a very nice list. But if you actually try to practice these things, to develop the habits of stillness, to develop the asceticism and the humility and the patience of listening to one another, and without exception, it's not these people need to listen, it's we need to listen to each other. I think this is actually a hugely demanding activity, which is why to situate it in terms of the relationship with the Spirit is so important. And then the three themes that we know, community, participation, and mission, as a way of being the church rather than, and I like the play the text makes a number of times, contrasting this to what it calls organizational expediency. It's not a matter of becoming more efficient. It's not a matter of becoming more or less bureaucratic. It's a matter of being converted. So if that situates the text, then how do we think about the text itself? The first, I want to make 3 points here that model themselves on what Orman Rush does in terms of thinking about the documents of Vatican II. Who wrote this document? And that's a very significant question in terms of the Synod process, because the Synod document, and I don't mean who wrote it in the sense of what's the names of the people on the authoring committee, but it's a work, the language that people use now in so much synodal theology is that the all, the some, and the one. The all being the one body of faith, the some being the bishops, and the one being the Pope. And often we're used to hearing the one or the some. I'd want to make the case that the synodal text is the work of the all. And that's so important that Pope Francis says, I'm not going to write my own document here, which every pope had done in the history of synods since Paul VI wrote Evangelii Nuntiandi in 1974. So this is the work of the world church as represented by that synodal gathering. It's not a program. It's not a plan for how you get to a better church. So the language it uses itself, pathways, practices, horizons, they're all open things. So it's an invitation document. I said before that the language of theology is exhortatory, and I think this is aligned with that, while also being inspirational. Aspirational. It does have a sense of what it would like us to be as a church. And then finally, the receivers is the church. What do we do with this? And here again, the language is very significant, and it's language that recurs through this text. And that is this wonderful phrase, unity and harmony in pluriformity. The language might be a little daunting, but it is saying we are not going to be one church without distinctions. We're not all going to be the same, but we are called to be one church. And that, of course, is where the rub is. How do we do this? How do we achieve this unity and harmony in pluriformity? And I think the short answer to that is we don't do it on our own. We have to do it together. So that means at every level of the church's life, the task is to develop unity and harmony in pluriformity at parish level, at groups within parish level, at diocesan level, and so it widens out. if we think about this Synod text as a way of conceiving the future, not in terms of it's giving us a plan for it, but it's giving us a sense of the ingredients, the components that go into it, then what we need to do as a church is to take that and see how we can combine these ingredients together. If it gave us a single way to do this, this is the only way you can be a church, a synodal church, then we'd either like it or dislike it. This way, we all get to contribute to it. We get to put together what it is that we are called to be. The document does name priorities. The first one is the opening sentence. I think the opening sentence of the Synod final document is a really beautiful and challenging thought. Every new step in the life of the church is a return to the source. It's not saying we've got to go backwards, we've got to become the church that we used to be, but the source of the church is not just back there, the source of the church is present, and that is the relationship that we have with God in Jesus Christ through the Holy Spirit. So it's constantly grounding us in that relationship over and above any particular views of the church that we might have. It's grounding us in the God who's always going to exceed our grasp. Because otherwise, one of us or all of us or parts of us could say, well, we've achieved the best possible church. And that we no longer need to keep moving. I think this text is saying exactly the opposite, and that everything about our past is to enlighten our present and our future. And aligned with that then is the shared openness to conversion, the fact that all of us are pilgrims, not merely some of us. And then it names a different set of activities for us, if you like, that this listening to Christ is not merely an internal individual reality, it's the faith of the whole people, all of us through our baptism, and that's why baptism is so central to thinking about synodality. All of us through our baptism are given the gift of the Holy Spirit that is a shared gift, so hence the need to keep listening to each other. But also, and this is a very powerful phrase, to listen to the wounds that continue to bleed in our world. Those who are excluded, those who are on the margins, looking to belong. Often we can have a sense that people on the margins are looking for a way out. They can be looking for a way in. And it's up to our listening to them and to new questions and so on to move in that direction. And that then moves us towards, well, what does this authentic church involve if we're going to be? And there are three themes that the document develops that I think are very powerful and reflect the coming out of the abuse crisis, coming out of the church's need for reform, its willingness to learn from the world, to be guided by best practices in other disciplines. So again, there's an emphasis in the document on being interdisciplinary, learning from other sources. And the three themes it names, which I'm sure you're familiar with: transparency, accountability, and evaluation. And it talks about these as requirements at every level of the church's life. Now, we know, I live in the United States and we lurch from one political crisis to another. And so often that is about transparency or its lack. So transparency is a crucial term. It's also a very challenging thing to accomplish. But what the document does is to locate it in relationship to accountability and to a process of evaluation. So really it's about developing a different culture of being the church. And it's not, this group needs to be more transparent, but the rest of us are free from being transparent or accountable or for undertaking processes of evaluation and all of our activities of the church. We need to keep thinking about this as a church-wide or a whole church sense. And what goes along then with these three attitudes is what I've already mentioned a number of times, namely the centrality of conversion. And it puts conversion always in the context of relationship. there's a very strong relational element that runs through this whole document, because the authenticity of the church is not, to go back to the phrase earlier, organizational expediency. The authenticity of the church is how we treat one another and how we engage with the world beyond ourselves. And the phrase I've underlined there, that this redirects each person's priorities. And again, I can't emphasize enough the importance of this all-inclusive need for conversion. And just moving quickly to the end now, what goes along with realizing all of these values is the process of formation. I think perhaps the most radical dimension of this whole document is its emphasis on formation. And look at this statement of it here, that the whole synod process, it says, will fall apart unless accompanied by focused formational processes. And it talks about what that involves, what's needed there, how we need to grow into this so that it's not just the process can be hijacked by one set or another set of voices. And here is its definition of formation, which I think is enormously helpful. Openness and encounter, sharing and collaboration, reflection and common discernment. So that's, again, that's church-wide. It's every aspect of our activity of church, and it's every one of us. And just to finish then, it links formation to the three themes: communion, participation, and mission. It talks about a differentiated co-responsibility. And just to go back to the first bullet point there, the overall vision of formation, integral, ongoing, and shared. And that aligns with what I said earlier about we don't get to the end of this process. We remain a pilgrim people. So I'll give the very final word for this to Pope Francis. This is Francis on discernment. This is such a challenging and yet powerful expression of what we are called to be. And the first one is to challenge our sense of that nothing will ever change. It's always going to be like this. And I again want to highlight that the need to change is not just about somebody else, it's also about me. So with that, I'll finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. Lots for us all to think about, and I'm very grateful to you. Our second speaker is Anne Benjamin. Anne is a Sydney-based writer, consultant, and educator with roots in the Hunter Valley of New South Wales and strong links with South India. She was the executive director of 75 schools in the Catholic Diocese of Parramatta in Western Sydney for 9 years. Anne co-authored with Charles Burford, Leadership in a Synodal Church. Over to you, Anne. We look forward to hearing very much what you have to say.
Thank you, John. And good evening, everyone. Thank you for the welcome and the opportunity to share a few thoughts here in a different key, perhaps from Richard's, but along the same theme. I'm speaking tonight from Garratt country, and I add my acknowledgements to those that John offered for us all earlier on. What are the potential benefits for Australian Catholicism in synodality? Many years ago, I visited the then newly constructed cathedral in San Francisco. Beneath its sweeping concrete, I remember more than anything its openness to the city. Each corner of the body of the cathedral features a clear glass. Set as it is on one of San Francisco's famous hills, the city is brought inside at the same time as the congregation is drawn outside into the city. It was 1970, and it delighted me with its resonance with the spirit of the Second Vatican Council. Some of you here tonight would have attended church or in tropical countries such as Papua New Guinea or the Pacific, where the walls of the churches are minimal. Unlike the solid brick fortress-like churches in many of our suburbs, these are gathering places of invitation that are open to observers from the outside, welcoming, sometimes desperately, any kind of breeze. These churches too speak of the spirit of Vatican II that finds expression in synodality. My own parish church in Western Sydney is shaped like a tent. Completed in 1963 at a cost of £60,000, its shape anticipated Vatican II's notion of the church as pilgrim people. These churches speak to me about possibilities for a church which is more synodal, in society and open to the world. The people of God journeying, moving, more fluid. A communion of faithful, not separated from their world, but immersed in it. When speaking of synodality, I hesitate to speak of a synodal church, although I often break my own rule. When Pope Francis was speaking to fellow Jesuits in Canada in July 2022, he made it clear that the phrase synodal church is a tautology. If it's not synodal, he said, it's not church. Think about that. If our Australasian church does not become more synodal, what are we? In Francis's terms, we will not be church. My other hesitation in referring to a synodal church is that it implies an end point of arrival. Sort of, are we there yet? Synodality is a way of being, and it will always be a work in progress. We can recognise the potential of synodality in its practical, grounded expressions and be encouraged by them. I recall such an experience from the years not long after Vatican II, before the decades when the council was put on hold, or in the freezer, as one Australian archbishop said recently, and long before Pope Francis started dropping the word synodality into our vocabulary. The PP in the regional city where I lived was probably in his 60s. He lived simply, wore his gold cross on his open neck collar with a worn fawn jumper. His kitchen table was a place where meals and ideas were shared. He was a man open to the world who read novels and the latest theology. In the years I knew him, he had one homily, served in 100 different ways, that the God of the Gospels and our church is a God of compassion and mercy. It was not a highly structured parish, in fact, very informal, but it was vibrant, engaged, outward-looking, participative, with a warm sense of community. It seemed only natural that we would join with the local Anglican church in occasional worship and reach out in active support to the church in Sri Lanka. I was part of that parish for only 3 years, but I've lived on that experience for many decades since. Its influence has fed my vision for the church that I have longed for. It gave me hope that it might emerge. It was a church without pretension and without walls, inviting strangers in and sending us out. It was a church in which the gospel was constantly being rewritten for its own time and place. While the PP's reflections on the word might have had a common theme, the revelation of God's love was new because he grounded it in our language and circumstances. This parish priest led through his integrity and humility. For me, the church in Australasia or elsewhere must continue its journey into greater synodality. It is an imperative of our fidelity as individual disciples and our integrity as a community of believers. This is simply what we are being called to at this time. Ultimately, my answer to the question, what are the potential benefits in becoming synodal, can be put in just one word: life. But let's put the question the other way. What is the outcome if Catholicism does not become more synodal? The alternative to renewal and life is a static institution that lingers on with somewhat archaic customs, quaint dress-ups, sustained by an inward-looking privatised piety and becoming an increasingly irrelevant subculture within the broad Australasian society. Richard has spoken of the Synod documents in an extremely helpful way. I will mention just one point from them at a more practical level. In the list of agenda facing local churches, the newly released Implementation Pathways document names these three: the obligation in dioceses and parishes to have participatory bodies that operate in a synodal key, regular local and regional ecclesial assemblies, the promotion of the diocesan synod and eparchical assembly. So in preparation for this evening, I took a stroll through the websites for all the Australian geographic dioceses. I apologise to those here tonight from the Pacific and beyond. I could have applied any number of lenses, but I specifically looked for references to diocesan pastoral councils, the 16th Synod of Bishops, and local synods or assemblies. And I found these references from the 28 Australian diocesan websites. I found 17 references to diocesan assemblies, consultations, synods, past or planned. And in the first instance, I must say this was really a stroll, and there may well be many more. One of the problems was some websites had no search facilities, and despite my best hunting around, I couldn't find more than this. I found 18 references to either the Synod, the Big Synod, or Synodality. Again, some were right there up front, some were well hidden. Some had not been updated since last October, but also some were present in themes without being named as Synodality. They were there under the theme of discernment, listening, dialogue. When I looked in July, just last week, I found 10 references to diocesan pastoral councils that are already existing or planned. Now, this compares with the reports of 5 Australian diocesan pastoral councils in Damien Gleeson's study in 2021. Again, there's a problem with this. This is not a scientific study. It is a stroll. Getting figures on these things is difficult because clerics do not always answer their mail. So if you're looking at this with the glass half empty, you might ask, where are the other 18 dioceses in terms of planning or having a diocesan pastoral council? But if you look with the glass half full mentality, you could say, well, there's a 100% increase since 2021. But something is happening, and change takes time, and deep change takes longer. At the same time, change can also just be as quick as the flash in which a leader says, let's do it. I assume that everyone is here tonight because we care. And the people who come together in forums like this around New Zealand, Australia, the Pacific, and the whole world care. Garratt cares, and we thank you for providing these opportunities. We gather as people of hope. We are a non-geographical community of faith, as I see it. And some of us are perhaps a little footsore and maybe heartsore, but we are all pilgrims. And what I want to say is that there are parishes, dioceses, ministries, and church agencies who are intentionally focusing on becoming more synodal, and we should be encouraged by that. Some of them include, at one end, highly structured processes in some city parishes I'm aware of, and at the other end, far less formal attempts. But they are all attempting to gauge with the challenge of the call to be a more synodal church. One country-based parish priest resisted his parish council's initial request when he arrived. They said to him, "What should we do, Father?" He turned the question back on them and he said, well, what do you think? And they said, but you're the parish priest, Father. And he replied, it's not my parish, it's our parish. And you will most probably be here longer than me. He says the parish council finally got the message, and they have assumed their own leadership in discerning the parish's way forward with him through assemblies and reflection. But this happened only because that parish priest exercised his leadership as a synodal leader and also exercised his priestly ministry not as head honcho, but as co-leader with all his parish. I know of at least one parish in Queensland where the parishioners worked in a synodal manner for many years, systematically informing themselves, discerning the way forward, revising their parish council constitution to reflect the concepts of the people of God in Lumen Gentium. After 15 years, a new PP arrived who declared he didn't believe in this kind of governance. Perhaps you've heard of something like that. Pilgrims will encounter obstacles. Anyone who's walked the Camino knows that. And even a roadblock as massive as this one that the parish encountered is not the end of the journey. This is the time, that is the time to engage in dialogue, in parrhesia, to challenge outmoded and what seems untenable interference in the baptized exercising their co-responsibility for mission. I'd like to give you some homework this evening, being an old teacher, and so ask you, what should the parish council in this parish do next? When Emeritus Bishop Peter Cullinane established the new Diocese of Palmerston North in New Zealand in the 1980s, he brought a solid knowledge of Vatican II and a deep valuing and experience in adult faith education. He tried to practice a kind of ecclesiology that underlies synodality. He said it was a primitive form of synodality, motivated by the fact that after hundreds of years of not being encouraged to speak up or speak back, the Catholic people needed forums in which to get used to doing so. He established 5 deanery pastoral forums, which were lay-led and opened up a wider level of involvement, just as he filled diocesan roles that had traditionally been led by priests with laymen and women and religious. So we are not starting from scratch, and there are Australasian dioceses where synodality is already at play. Again, it doesn't happen by chance, and only when bishops have done it deliberately. Why do I keep talking about synodality? Why do I spend a lot of my time reading, thinking, discussing, and writing about a synodal church and the leadership it needs? Like any faith story, it is personal. For years, my colleague and friend Charles Burford and I have engaged in deliberate conversation around our faith and our church. Following the Royal Commission, Bishop Vincent Long initiated discussion about the urgency of cultural change in the church. That prompted our first book, Leadership in a Synodal Church. Through our response to Vincent's challenge, we've been able to carry that discussion that he began with ministry groups, parishes, clergy, deacons, and seminarians. So discussion can be something that grows as it continues to roll on. And as it continues and widens, understanding can become clearer, deeper, and more personally owned. The church is no longer the same church it was in 2018. So Charles and I have discussed ourselves into another book, and the key reference point of that book is the final document from the Synod. As educators, we are eternally hopeful. Our conversations pivot around recurring themes, that synodality is about culture and culture runs deep, so it will not easily change. It is about leadership, and leadership needs to be informed. It's about mission, whatever that means, because we are synodal for the sake of a gospel that always has to be written in the language of our times. It is about our children, but especially our daughters and our granddaughters, not just church insiders, but the majority who live more or less happily without church. And so it's about meaning. While we approach things differently, we both are always trying to imagine synodality in practice, grounded in the here and now. It's very easy for us to think within the institutionalized frameworks of our personal and professional lives. We've started to challenge each other to think outside the words mission, communion, participation, to what they might mean to those outside the church when they experience them. I believe our synodality will be measured by the extent to which we are in dialogue with all people, those of other faiths, as well as those within our communities. Thomas Halleck challenges us as a church to be in dialogue, especially with those whose faith is not expressed in religious terms, to go into the marketplace and discover a spirituality that addresses the needs and searching of the people of our time. What was that beautiful phrase listen to the wounds that continue to bleed in our world. It is about discovering the gospel for families, workers, the addicted, the stressed, the anxious, the oppressed, the forgotten, those on the edges of civil society. What gospel do we have for the people of Gaza, for our poor afflicted Mother Earth? Within our parishes, dioceses, agencies, ministries, also, we need to attend to the gap between those longing for a synodal way and those who fear it. I'll just take 1 minute, John. There is
certainly, Anne. Take a couple.
Take a couple, thank you. There is no formula to make local churches synodal. There are resources, certainly, especially the inspiration of those who've gone before. Synodality is worked out on the spot in each place. It is a process, a way. The starting point is always here and now, and it is often messy. I believe it is important to keep discussing with those who share a commitment to a discipleship of synodality. Conversation can nourish each of us on the journey. As we share what we value, the vision becomes clearer and our enthusiasm can grow. I suspect that synodality comes through small, unpretentious actions, not with trumpets, with a bit of milling around and lots of listening. We will wind our way around towards becoming more synodal, towards becoming more gospel-centered, and we will need to continue to wind and backtrack and reorient again. So where do we start? We start within our own sphere of influence. The track there is the pathway beside the creek at Toongabbie, where I live. So that's where I start. Starting where we are is the incarnational character of God's revelation in Jesus. At a certain time and place, God's word becomes visible. An early point, a starting point might well be in setting up structures and processes that express and promote synodality, such as pastoral councils at all levels and assemblies and so on, but only if they are done in a way which is enlivened by the Spirit. Otherwise, they will dash our hopes. And while it's not about becoming more efficient, I do believe a big block to the success of some of these structures is often very poor organisation. Thomas Halleck counsels that genuine renewal of the church will not be generated at the desks of bishops or in councils or conferences of experts. Instead, it requires powerful spiritual impulses, thorough theological reflection, and the courage to experiment. I ask myself over and over, what is God's word now in this place? How do we together, as small groups of believers, bring the face of Jesus to our world now? Thank you. Some references.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anne. let's now take 30 seconds just for a break. We've been listening for 40 minutes now, 40 to 45 minutes. So I think we deserve just at least a 30-second break. Perhaps while people think of questions, some have come in already. And each of the speakers can reflect on perhaps what the other has said. They probably haven't heard the full version of what the other speaker was going to say. I'll wait now for just a few seconds before starting Q&A. When questions come in, I'll ask each of the speakers from their own perspectives how they would respond. I think the beauty of Anne and Richard speaking to us this evening is that in many ways they come from different places in the church, different perspectives, different experiences, and I know they'll answer from those different places and different experiences. Okay, let me begin with a question which comes right to the, this is from Michael. To each of you, you may feel you've answered the question. How do we avoid synodality, including this webinar, becoming little more than a talk fest? Richard. You're on mute, Richard.
That took me back to the pandemic with people saying, you're still muted.
Yes, that's right.
So look, this is getting the balance of this right is the challenge, isn't it? Talkfest is such a pejorative term. You know, there's no good talkfest. A talkfest by definition is a bad thing. But we've got to be careful here of not throwing out babies and bathwaters simultaneously. In other words, we do need to get together. We do need to be able to listen to each other. And that's going to involve at different times being willing to be patient enough to hear something from somebody else without me dismissing it as a talkfest. I absolutely realize that you can have experiences where people just, everyone talks, then everyone goes home and nothing changes. That's not a healthy thing. But I think the stimulus that comes from being together and listening and contributing does plant seeds, or at least can plant seeds, that can then carry on to precisely what Anne was talking about, namely, how does this happen locally? Natalie Beccard, who's the Undersecretary of the Synod, and I should say a former student of Boston College, she has a saying that synodality begins with a cup of coffee. In other words, it's the experience of being together and listening that does plant seeds of hope and change. So while I appreciate the question as that getting together and talking is not all we want to do, it can contribute to what gets translated into action. Documents, the sort of one of the principles of reading church documents is a text that's not read is dead. And in this instance, that gets back to, we have this synod document. It's a challenging document. It's 55 pages of text, so it's a long document. It's not written in obscure speak, but it does require digestion. And it's the process of the being willing to do that and hopefully do it together in different groups that I think provides the foundations for the actions that people want. So I guess that's, in a broad sense, my question is, my response is to challenge the terms of the question while also appreciating the danger that's properly named in the question, but not wanting, if we simply say it's a talk fest, that gives us a way out. You know, it means I don't have to listen to this. I don't have to take any responsibility. Whereas I think both what Anne and I were both saying is precisely the opposite. This is about everybody.
Thanks, Richard. Anne?
Richard has answered that better than I could, and I just wanted to add, we're not just heads on this journey and in our faith. I mean, and we need the support that comes from knowing other people. We are with fellow travelers, and we take heart from that. And to me, that's part of the discussion and talking together as well.
Thanks, Anne. Vivian says, particularly to Richard, how confident are you that formation will be able to be delivered to respond to the huge need? We have lost so many previously vibrant resources in many dioceses. And that fits in with Tricia asking, is anyone working on providing support for parish groups who are full of good intentions but have no idea where to start? Richard and Anne. Richard first, perhaps.
Thank you, John. Look, I absolutely appreciate the challenge of this. That's why I think I said in my presentation that I think one of the most radical elements of this text is when it talks about formation. And it's not only saying we need formation, it actually goes on to say that we must provide resources to form formators. I think that's the most stunning part of even the whole section on formation, that we can't just say, yeah, people need formation. Yes, of course we do. But we do have to be able to put the resources behind it. And that is a challenge. I appreciate that when dioceses have often cut back a lot of offices. So, and this is really where the rubber is going to hit the road, I think, in terms of, are we going to be committed to what the Synod is calling us to do? And what's that going to mean in terms of providing resources for forming formators, for spiritual directors, for... I think a lot of it exists on the ground anyway. It's how do you bring it together and make use of it. So I wouldn't in any way diminish the challenge of that, but I think the challenge has to be held in relationship with what the benefit of it is. So that's why, again, I keep going back to this. This is not about expediency. This is about a long-term investment in a different church. I mean, Anne made that point a number of times that there's no quick fix here. And I think there is no quick fix to a lack of formational opportunities. But it's the commitment to develop them that is going to make the change. So, and it's not that everyone, this is where we've got to think, I think, strategically about resources. How do we develop resources that different groups and different dioceses can share rather than everyone has their own silo of resources and this is mine and I'm not going to share it with you. So how are we going to do this, if you like, synodally? How are we going to have formation process that reflect the synodal experience and the relational nature of who we are as a church? I acknowledge that there's more questions there than answers, but I think letting in those questions is at least the beginning of bringing about change.
Thanks, Richard. Anne?
Yes, and the final document is very strong on the area of formation, as Richard said when he was presenting. And one of the strongest themes coming through, reflecting the consultations during the Synod, was that formation is done across the church. It's not done in silos. So it's the seminarians and those preparing for priesthood are learning or being formed and going through processes with the community as well. Obviously, there are specialized areas, but that was probably one of the strongest themes coming through the final document. I love that idea, Richard, of doing it synodally, you know, that parishes linking up with each other, pooling their resources for no other reason, pooling the resources of those who were taking part and coming together, as well as the people available. I had the joy of being one of the writers for the synthesis document for the Synod for Parramatta Diocese and also for the Diocesan Synod. And one of the submissions that hit me extraordinarily was and I have permission to name them, the submission from the Sisters of Mercy. And they spoke about a 60-year journey into synodality from Vatican to where they are now. And one of the biggest elements of that was their investment in formation and education and in a wide sphere of disciplines. And they put real dollars in it and invested in their sisters. But they also said that learning challenged them afresh to think again of their relationships with the community, within the church, and with ministry. And it's a story that, to me, is always very encouraging but informative. They're talking a 60-year journey. But I'm also inspired by the religious congregations who are now very generously reaching out with formation opportunities for young people, for young women, for leaders, and within their ministry areas, put the emphasis on formation there through the public juridic persons. Just agreeing with what Richard is saying, and then throwing a few more thoughts in there as well. Thanks very much, Anne. The questions and the responses we're getting are so diverse. I just might read a few of them, and you may wish just to comment on one or two, each of you. Hayden asks, where might those dedicated to retaining the Latin Mass fit in all of this? Margaret asks, how do you suggest we can renew a parish when the priest is not interested? Shirley asks, how does the concept of synodality of the church, how can it be Christ-centered in a classroom that is very diverse and secular? And Justin, more a statement than a question, we can't afford to wait for top-down initiatives. We have to start from the bottom up with a sense of urgency. Over to you, Richard, first. You may like to pick up one or two of those points.
Thanks, John. I'd certainly agree that this has to be about every level of the church's life. I don't think either Anne or I have talked about anything being top down. We've both talked about whole church perspectives, and I often say this, that there's nothing. We don't need a new legislation or new canon law to enable us to talk to each other. We don't need any sort of change to allow every group in the life of the church, be it the local St. Vincent de Paul Society, be it the Parents and Friends, any other, to work synodally. That people can do that now. That we don't need permission. We don't need new structures. We just need to recognise that we all have gifts to contribute, and that, again, keep emphasising the process of listening. The one, John, that sort of piqued my interest when you talked about the Latin Mass, I mean, there's a difference between everyone being able to be listened to and our differences respected and our unity and harmony and pluriformity. But in the end, we do still have to be a communion. So that there's a challenge in that. It's not, well, I prefer this and I'll go over there and you prefer that and you go over there. We do need to keep working on how we worship together. And, there are avenues for Latin, and this is, I'm talking about the new rite rather than the old rite. Again, these are complex issues, but taking as a value that unity and harmony and pluriformity can provide at least a pathway to think about this, rather than I'm only going to play if I get everything to go the way I want it to be. So that's why I keep saying there's a challenge in this for everyone, not just for some of us. But I'm happy to stop there, and I'll hand Anne the education related question.
That was the one I was avoiding, I think. I just wanted to make a comment on the parish one where the parish priest isn't interested, and I just think that there are a couple of responses to that I mentioned before. Act within your own sphere of influence, and we can't be synodal alone. It's not a solitary exercise. So we have to work in groups and with other people. So in that situation, Margaret, I think it was, finding other people to sit down and maybe a starting point are the documents or some introduction to them, because they are, Richard, you opened them up and drew really pertinent points to our attention, but they are churchy documents still, aren't they? And so taking them on raw can sometimes be a little challenging, but they're not a bad place to start, except I wouldn't take the whole lot on or be indigestion.
No, you can do it in chunks. I mean, it's designed that way, it's written in sort of 10-page chapters, which are not too overwhelming.
And they are drastically different from earlier documents in that
absolutely, yes.
The whole index is in terms of metaphors and things like that. All the way, they're quite
the little gospel pericopes that they have at the beginning of each chapter to focus it, which was that none of that was in the draft in the Instrumentum Laboris, the working document. But that's a really wonderful way in for groups to use this text as a meditative experience, to take chapter by chapter rather than I have to digest 50 pages in one go. I don't have to do that.
Yeah. The other thing is slightly sideways, a question that wasn't asked in one sense, is that about dialogue. Sometimes we do pigeonhole people a little bit. I think it's very easily done in our church. We say, oh, well, they're to the left and they're to the right, or they're our men or women or whatever. But sometimes there is a moment in an encounter when we can pause and just stop. That instead of someone saying, oh, I don't agree with you, and we say, okay then, and have a nice day, that sometimes there is a moment of stillness or grace where we say, tell me a little bit more about that. And we can pause and invite a conversation to understand a little bit more about someone who's coming from a completely different point of view from oneself.
Thank you.
And John, if I might just quickly, I think that to invite someone who says, I don't like synodality, I don't think it's got anything to say to me, to invite them with you to read that document. One of the really radical things the document says about formation is that bishops need formation. I've never seen anyone say that directly before. So, to invite bishops into this process as well, I think is a really crucial thing, because I don't see how you could read that document and think it's got nothing to say to me. So I think the invitation to participate is really crucial.
Thank you. Thank you both. I'll just read a few more. There was one comment, Anne, thanking you for pointing out that some parishes have acted synodally for quite some time. So that was appreciated. A couple of others mentioned parish priests. One said, Terry says, is the parish priest the place to start asking where we can raise the questions? And Jeff asks, how important for the promotion of synodality is it to have parish priests involved, but how can that be achieved? There was also a comment and a question about communication within the church. I think the basis of that was that the documents are not well known within the church. How can we improve communication within the church? I'll leave those questions there and see if Anne or Richard would like to pick up one or two of them before I move on.
And you want to start?
Yeah, I'll just start on that communication one, not with an answer, but to add to the question, because it's something that I puzzle over a little bit. I'm in a diocese that has a wonderful website that's full of resources and material for anyone who wants to go further, and we have opportunities. But I would say in my own parish, maybe 95% of the people wouldn't visit that website for various reasons. Then there is that one moment in the week, the assembly, and that's such a precious time. And we are there to worship and give thanks together, and also reflect on the word and listen. And so I just think it is an enormous challenge that we have to put our minds to in terms of communication, how we do. I mean, COVID was a blessing in one sense in giving us Zooms. But I do think it is I'm just agreeing with the questioner that it is something we should be putting our minds to, how to maximize the communication.
And
The
Richard?
Synod website itself, the Synod for the whole church, is far and away the best website that you'd ever see in the Vatican. It's like somebody told them the 21st century has begun. It really is the most accessible website. It's organized, it's vivid, that everything you want to know is there. It is an extraordinary breakthrough in the way the church has communicated, I think. So that's the first thing that I think I want to take up just something on the parish priest thing. It saddens me often that it almost seems that parish priests particularly get known for their capacity to stop things. And I'm not sure why you'd want to be known for that. You know, what's the achievement in stopping something rather than being open to it? You know, to keep realizing this is a process and a document of the whole church. I mean, this has been open to everybody in the church to contribute to it. I often use the Australian experience with students here in talking about the plenary council, you know, that the initial processes of consultation got, what was it, 220,000 responses. Why would you not want to be part of that? Why would you want to sort of be an obstacle to this reaching as many people as possible, to having a parish where people are engaged? This is not a matter of faith or morals. It's not a matter of doctrine. It's a matter of listening to the gift of the Spirit that all of the baptized have. Now, that can make everyone's life a little more complicated. It's much easier if I'm in charge and I make all the decisions and there's no accountability, transparency, or evaluation. But what do you gain by having accountability, transparency, evaluation? So it's thinking about it not as what is lost, but what is gained. And I would hope that this mythical parish priest who is always opposed to everything can actually come to see that.
Can I just make a comment about the mythical parish priest too? In that I'm aware of a situation where the parish priest came in new to the parish and new to being a parish priest, and was at first resistant to the idea of annual general meeting and elections for the pastoral council, which had been part of the tradition in that particular place. But some of the old guard and the current parish council engaged with him in conversation and said, well, look, this is the way we've been doing things around here, and why. And ultimately, that parish priest took that advice and acted on it, and has picked up and moved forward. So I know it's not always that simple, but it's not always that bad either.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Richard. I'll just move through a few other questions. There's never enough time. Can you please share some practical ideas about how a parish can become synodal, drawing on insights from the final document on the Synod on Synodality? Some of the answers, I think, have gone to that to some extent already. Does synodality have boundaries so that we do not lose the way of our Catholic faith? How do you see that? We've talked about parish priests. Gerard asks, how do you see the bishops in Australasia, New Zealand, or the USA leading us to become a more synodal church. So moving on to bishops. Anne asks, is a synodal church possible beyond a parish model? And finally, for this batch, Tony asks, is there a generation gap in our synodal journey? I see that my peers, the boomers, enthused and excited, but the Gen Zs are known as having a different cultural zone, embracing digital connection, individualism alongside a search for authenticity and connection. How do we make 55 pages accessible to the next generation? There's food for thought for both Richard and Anne. Perhaps if you could just each take just one or two of those. Richard.
Okay, let me start with the bishops, perhaps. There's a wonderful phrase that Pope Francis has in Evangelii Gaudium. I want to say it's about number 38, but that's an even longer document. It's more complex, so I don't want to play bingo on what the numbers are. But where he describes 3 roles for a bishop. At some point, he said, a bishop will lead, calling people forward. At other times, a bishop will be in the midst of people, sharing with them the direction of their journey. And the third instance is that sometimes a bishop will need to be led by the people and called to exercise his role, paradoxically, leading by willing to being led. I think that's such a powerful image, because he's not saying choose one of those 3 and work with that. He's saying all 3 of those are part of the life of a bishop. So I would want to put that to bishops in a non-threatening way, as an invitation to them to think about, and this goes to the boundaries question, which I acknowledge is an important question. I think if we keep grounding this process in our openness to the Spirit, in our returning to the source, to quote that opening sentence again, that helps to make sure that this is an authentic experience of faith. There's a difference between naming something as a danger and treating it as an inevitability. Not every danger is an inevitability in terms of its realization. So I think holding that tension is a really important thing. And if we keep grounding ourselves in that we are seeking to be open to the Spirit, which is the wide tradition of faith, the needs of the present, but also that we are called beyond the present, I think they're all ways that can contribute to helping this process be enriching for the life of the church rather than threatening for it. So I'm happy to finish on that.
Thanks, Richard. Anne?
My comment on the bishops one is that I think it's important for credibility amongst the faithful that people know that the bishops as a whole are committed to learning and committed to taking it forward. I'm not making any comment on whether or not they are, but it needs to be visible. It needs to be seen and known that the bishops too are saying we are learning, and also just taking up that those themes from the document that Richard referred to earlier, really significant themes around transparency, accountability, and evaluation. I understand that back in the 90s, was it that the Australian Bishops' Conference approved or legislated, or whatever the Bishops' Conference does, an appraisal process, a performance review process for priests, parish priests. If no one knows that there's an appraisal process, whether or not it goes on is another question, but if no one knows, what's the point? It's not very transparent or accountable. Just a comment.
Thanks very much, Anne. I'll read a few more, even if just to make them public, I think. If we say we're a community of faithful people, how do we talk about the challenging, difficult stuff in our lives? How can we become aware of the Spirit as well as saying common words? Patricia asks, what tips for guarding against burnout? Our diocese has just started on our journey, and it's a joy for me. And finally, Joanna says, I'll read some of it. I agree the final synod document is about returning to the source, as both of you have said. Number 60 says the issue of women deacons remains open and what comes from the Holy Spirit cannot be stopped. In terms of translating into action, how can we help bishops who are synodal to make independent decisions in this regard and respond to the worldwide movement to return to the source? For example, ordain women in ministry who are called to the diaconate. There's 2 or 3 comments and questions, Richard and Anne. Maybe you'd like to take one each. Anne?
Well, I suppose the burnout one is probably the simplest in one sense. I guess that's where the care of the community, we need to be nurturing of each other. I mean, there, as I think it was Tricia who mentioned that, said, I mean, there is energy and excitement in terms of beginning the journey, but in any long journey, there is exhaustion and times, and we just need the care of each other, the care of the group, and in some ways that's part of the responsibility of the leader, whether that's the leader in the parish, in a ministry, or in a diocese, to watch for that, to see the pace and what's happening. To start.
Thanks, Anne. Richard?
Maybe to take up the diaconate question, it is really quite telling that the way they phrase it in that document, where they actually say, you know, this is a question, it's not going away. That's the nature of questions. You can't legislate a question out of existence. So if a question is a question, it will stay there until you can move towards a resolution of it. I think that's what the document is encouraging us to. It's not saying we've got to ordain women tomorrow, and I know that frustrated a lot of people, but it's also not saying we're never going to ordain women to the diaconate. It is saying this question is not going away. So how do we respond to it? How do we allow the question to be there and not to become simply a point of division? And that's a really crucial tension to hold. It goes back to the prior one about boundary. That because in the end, we are trying to move to a situation where we resolve questions in ways that build communion, participation, and mission rather than damaging it. Now, how does that translate into what it's going to look like, you know, next year, in 5 years, in 10 years? I don't know, but I think that's part of the responsibility that, you know, now sits with Pope Leo. This is where his role as chief shepherd, as the one who is meant to integrate the life of the whole community, does become hugely significant. And the fact that Francis published that synod document as it was without saying, no, you can't include that bit, I think that is a very strong point towards openness. And I think we just got to keep allowing this to develop. I don't know exactly how that will be, but the question is not going to go away. That much is unequivocally clear, I think.
John, could I add just a quick comment on the question or comment about the difficult times and the difficult circumstances? I think that is a real change of culture for us, because I think we, the older ones of us, have been educated in a church where you made sure you said the right thing, and I think some of our teachers are fearful of that in terms of when they're teaching religious education. They're very anxious to teach the right thing, which I think is a real challenge, because many of them are at a point in their life when they should be growing in their own faith, and questions are part of it. But it is the test of the trust and the test of the communion, isn't it? If we are able to tolerate that honesty and frankness and still respect each other.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Richard. Unfortunately, looking at, we have 64 questions and comments have been made. It's always disappointing that we can't address all of them. Could I just make a couple of comments on that, though. One is that each of the questions will be brought to the attention of the speakers, even the ones that haven't been asked this evening. And secondly, if there really is some specific point that you would like to follow up with Anne or Richard, please do write to ACCCR, and we'll be prudent, but they may be able to pass one or two of them on to Richard and Anne for their response. I will finish by just reading one comment and then move to Sue Chen. How will M says, how will we encourage young people to come along and be part of a parish where we want to be synodal? We have mainly older members who are now tired and have done their bit in the parish in the past. I'll leave that hanging because it's a question which always comes up in these sorts of discussions. We now reach the stage where Sue Chen will give a response. Sue is an educator who worked in Catholic education for 34 years, including 11 years as principal of Marist Regional College in Burnie in northwest Tasmania. Since 2023, Sue has been chair of Concerned Catholics Tasmania, established in 2020 by members of the lay faithful. Concerned Catholics Tasmania promotes the decisions of the Plenary Council and the Synod, and I would say it is one of the most admirable and valuable church reform groups in Australasia. Over to you, Sue.
Thank you very much, John. And I'm talking from Nipaluna country, Hobart, where we've had two wonderful contributions this evening. And I'll start with Richard's powerful exhortation to grasp the vision of the final document in ways that are both personal and relational. At the core is our relationship with God, who will always exceed our grasp. And we're called to move towards fullness of God as a pilgrim people, open to growth and conversion. And both Richard and Anne use that expression of a pilgrim people open to growth and conversion, which is very powerful. So who would I be in that church? It's so easy to talk about other and, what someone else is not, or groups are not doing, but it's about us and I and how we're being called to conversion. We're reminded that the final document is aspirational. It's a vision. It's not a set of rules that we now have to follow. It's up for us to grasp the nettle. And so essential to that is a spiritual disposition. So it's about silence, contemplation, as well as participation, communion and mission. And it was so interesting watching the first and the second sessions of the Synod, how to begin with, there was a little bit of an emphasis, or I guess was important to me, the awareness that people had different opinions. People were coming to Rome and quite very different opinions about women's role in the church or LGBTIQ. And yet by the second session, the end of the second session, there were so many participants who talked about that, the importance of the listening, the dialogue, and ultimately discernment. And I was very pleased to hear Anne's notion of when someone says something that you would disagree with, well, tell me more about that. And so that as a result of what appeared to be very different opinions, by the end of the second session, there was able to be written this document, which was the document of everyone who was at the Synod and was the churches, the full churches document, the international churches document, because we all had opportunity to participate in the preparations. Richard finished off talking about formation and the importance formation and helping us all to work together to in our parishes and in our dioceses to do synodality. It's not something that we can just do automatically. And one of the questions was about talk fests. So how do we avoid talk fests? And some of the good ideas that were listed were let's use the work of dioceses that are doing it very well. For example, Parramatta. Let's share. The Synod website that was exciting to hear how powerful that is and could be used. I'll move on now to Anne's presentation. And look, many moments resonated, not least of all that imagery of beautiful churches, San Francisco, Parramatta, Papua New Guinea, churches that open out to the community and they draw people in. And you use the word again of a pilgrim people immersed in the world, and use that to describe synodality. Many of us, I suspect, have our own images or memories of the priest in a worn fawn jumper. Might have been a different colour. Not focused on control of the parish, but making space for the baptised faithful to participate in a vision of church of mercy and compassion. In the years following Vatican II, there was enthusiasm and participation. What happened since is a discussion for another time. But Anne reminds us that we are still here. In fact, over 1,700 signed up for this webinar. So that gives you an idea that many of us are here, many of us are listening this evening because we care, we hope, and we are pilgrims. At a broader level, Anne reminds us that there are Australasian dioceses where synodality is at play, even if only 5 in Australia have active DPCs. It is a start. Now, in my own diocese of Hobart, there is no DPC. However, we're proud that in the 1970s, Archbishop Guildford Young came back from Vatican II. He helped the DPC to be formed, and he said that only in extraordinary circumstances would he not abide with the decisions made by the council. And there is that notion of there is always change, but we come back to the source. So these ideas aren't always new. Anne reminds us that change is difficult, especially where culture is concerned. But I did love the fact that you gave us some homework, Anne. Like any good teacher, what do we do if the parish priest rejects participative governance? And but like a great teacher, she gave us some clues. And I'd like to just highlight those. Synodality is messy. It's a process. We need to gather, we need to embrace conversations that nourish, share what we value, and the vision will become clearer. Take small, unpretentious actions, do lots of listening, be gospel-centred, start within our own spheres of influence. St. Vincent de Paul was mentioned, just little groups after Mass where we get together for a cup of coffee can be a start. Heed Thomas Halleck's call to have courage to experiment. And I loved this last one. Good organisation is the key. So if Australasian Catholicism is going to become more synodal, we need to be a people immersed in the world. And the potential benefit is life. At all times, we remember the core question: how do we bring the face of Jesus to our world? Thanks, John.
Thanks, Sue. And thanks to Anne and Richard. We now reach the stage where we have to draw our webinar to a close. I want to thank you all again for participating in large numbers. You may have noticed there are about 600 people on the call, and many, many more have registered and will see the video recording, which will be issued in due course. please consider supporting ACCCR financially if you are able to enable this work, these webinars and other sorts of work of ACCCR to continue. Visit the website or press the button on the invitation that you received to this webinar. Thanks again to our wonderful speakers, Richard and Anne and Sue. Thanks to our technical support from James McEwen. Thanks to Garratt Publishing, without whom these events could not occur. I would flippantly or not so flippantly say happy synodality. It is challenging. It's a winding path, as Anne said, but let's hope we're on that path and all of us can play a part in that. So good night. I hope you've enjoyed the past hour and a half in our webinar, and we hope to see you on another occasion. Thanks again.